They said it was just a joke, something lighthearted to break the tension, a game that would bring laughter and closeness. But when my son grabbed the duct tape and wrapped it tightly around my wrists, snapping the tape with a flourish as everyone else laughed, I felt something inside me snap too. His eyes caught mine for just a moment, a flicker of amusement and mischief dancing there, but no apology, no hesitation. "It's just for fun, Mom," he said quickly, as if I might take it the wrong way, as if I might be too old or too serious to understand. I smiled politely, not wanting to ruin the evening, not wanting to be the woman who couldn't laugh along with her family. But as the tape clung cold and tight around my hands, as I sat there feeling the sting of humiliation masked by a forced smile, I knew this night would mark a turning point. I was 74 years old, a woman who had once spent her life surrounded by books as a librarian, who had patiently read to generations of children, who had nurtured and guided, who had been a mother and grandmother, the heart of my family's story. But tonight I was something else entirely, a prop in a game I never asked to play, a quiet prisoner in the house that was supposed to be my home, a woman whose presence was tolerated only as long as it served someone else's amusement. Now I live alone in a small apartment above a modest flower shop in Cleveland. The place is quiet, sometimes too quiet, but it is mine. I keep the windows open when the spring comes, letting in the scents of lilacs and fresh earth. And I talk to the old spider plant on the windowsill as if it were a friend. My hands still remember how to hold a book with care, how to turn pages slowly so as not to tear them. But they also remember the cold tightness of that tape, the helplessness that comes when your body is bound and your spirit feels even more so. I did not speak of that night for a long time. The memory sat quietly inside me, like a folded letter I was too afraid to open, too afraid to let the words out. There were other nights before that, moments when the laughter in the room was never meant for me, when I was the invisible woman in the photographs, the voice that was spoken over, the presence that could be easily forgotten. But nothing cut as deep as that night when my son, the boy I had raised and loved, tied my hands as a joke and left me there while the game went on without me. I had thought, perhaps foolishly, that the years would bring us closer, that the wrinkles on my face and the gray in my hair would be badges of honor, tokens of a life lived well and with kindness. Instead, I was a punchline. I was a secret kept behind polite smiles and hushed tones. Even my grandchildren, whose cheeks I had kissed and whose scraped knees I had bandaged, laughed when they saw me tied up, as if I were a clown in a circus act, rather than the woman who had baked their birthday cakes and stayed up late helping with homework. The house that had once been filled with warmth and stories now felt cold and sharp, like a room I had entered by mistake and could not leave. My son's laughter was loudest of all, ringing in my ears long after the game had ended and the guests had gone home. That night, after the others had gone to bed, I sat on the edge of the living room couch with my hands still bound, wondering when I had last felt truly seen. I thought about the years of quiet sacrifices, the meals cooked without thanks, the nights spent worrying about everyone but myself. I thought about the ways I had folded myself small to fit into the roles expected of me. The dutiful mother, the doting grandmother, the woman who never made waves. And I realized, with a sudden clarity that frightened me, that I was no longer willing to be invisible. The tape around my wrists was a symbol, yes, but the true binding was the silence I had agreed to keep for so long. I unwrapped the tape slowly, feeling the sting on my skin, and promised myself that this would be the last time I let someone else control my hands, my voice, my life. In the days that followed, I moved through my routines with a new awareness, the warmth of the morning sun on my face, the scent of freshly brewed coffee, the gentle hum of the city waking up outside my window. All of it felt sharper, more vivid. I began to see the small acts of kindness I had overlooked. The florist downstairs who always saved me the last violet bouquet. The barista who remembered my name and my order without asking. The neighbor who waved whenever I passed by. These small connections, fragile and tentative, became the threads of a new tapestry I was weaving for myself. I was no longer tied down by the expectations of a family that had forgotten to see me. My story is not one of grand escapes or dramatic confrontations. It is the quiet unfolding of a woman reclaiming her dignity, her autonomy, her right to be heard, and to belong on her own terms. The night my son tied my hands as a joke was the night I began to untie the knots inside me, the years of neglect and dismissal, and learn how to stand tall again. It has been a journey marked by small victories and deep wounds, by moments of loneliness and unexpected joy, by the steady rebuilding of a self that had been buried beneath layers of silence and compliance. So this is who I am now, a woman who has learned that hands meant for holding others must sometimes hold themselves first. A woman who has discovered that it is never too late to say no to being a joke, to being overlooked, to being silenced. A woman who waits no longer for permission to live fully and freely. And if you find yourself in the shadows of someone else's game, know this: your hands are yours, your voice is yours, and you have the power to untie yourself, one quiet step at a time. The moment I realized that the evening was no longer just a game, no longer just laughter and shared stories, but something far more painful, came slowly, like a shadow creeping in around the edges of a well-lit room. It began with a glance from my son that was no longer playful, no longer warm, but cold and distant. After he wrapped the duct tape around my wrists and secured it firmly, he stepped back with a smirk that made my heart tighten. The others laughed, the children giggled, and for a moment I tried to laugh too, to be the good sport, to be the mother and grandmother who never made a fuss. But inside, a quiet storm was gathering. They didn't hurry to untie me. The tape stayed wrapped tight. The game went on without me, as if I were an obstacle or an afterthought, rather than the woman who had spent decades holding this family together. I watched as cards were dealt, dice rolled, and jokes cracked, but none of those moments were for me. I was a spectator, trapped in a seat no one cared to share. The joke was no longer funny. The catalyst that shattered whatever fragile illusion I had left came when the youngest of the grandchildren looked at me and asked, "Grandma, why can't you play?" His voice was soft, confused, and for a fleeting second, the room went quiet. Everyone else seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see how I would respond. I looked at my bound hands and then at his wide eyes, searching for an answer that would make sense to him, that would not hurt or embarrass anyone. But there was no kind answer. I swallowed the lump rising in my throat and said, "Because I'm tied up, sweetheart." The innocence of the question made the room crack. The laughter returned, but it was sharper now, more brittle, like breaking glass. My son made a joke about how I needed to learn to loosen up, and how this would teach me to take a joke better. I felt the words like a slap across my face. What was meant to be lighthearted suddenly carried the weight of something darker, a message not just about a game, but about my place in this family, about how easily I could be dismissed and controlled, how my voice could be silenced without a second thought. In the quiet moments that followed, when the children were called upstairs for bed, and the adults gathered in small groups around the kitchen, I was left alone on the couch, still taped. The rough texture of the duct tape burned my skin as I shifted, trying not to fidget or draw attention. My son came over, untied the tape with an exaggerated carelessness, and said, "Don't be so sensitive, Mom." It was all in good fun. His words echoed hollowly in the room. I wanted to tell him that fun was not something that left me feeling powerless, humiliated, and invisible, but I swallowed my pride and nodded, because I had learned long ago that speaking up often meant being shut down. Instead, I picked up my purse, tucked my aching hands inside, and slipped out of the room before anyone could notice the tears I did not allow myself to shed. That night, as I lay in bed with the silence pressing in on me, I thought about every time I had bent so far backward to keep the peace that I lost sight of my own worth. I thought about the holidays when I was overlooked, the birthdays that passed without a call, the dinners where I was expected to listen but never to be heard. This moment, being tied up and laughed at, was not an isolated incident, but a culmination of years of quiet erasure. It was the stark, unspoken truth laid bare. I was not seen as a woman deserving of respect, but as a fixture in the background, a character in someone else's story rather than the author of my own. The tape on my wrists was a cruel symbol of the invisible bonds that had held me captive for decades, bonds made of neglect, dismissal, and unspoken resentments. The days that followed were a slow unraveling of the life I thought I knew. I noticed how my son's tone changed when he spoke to me. Less patient, more clipped, as if my presence was an inconvenience rather than a comfort. Invitations became fewer and less sincere, visits shorter and filled with a polite but hollow distance. I realized with a sinking heart that the game night was not just a cruel joke, but a sign of something far deeper, the erosion of a relationship I had once thought unbreakable. The warmth that had once filled the rooms where we gathered was replaced by an uncomfortable chill, a growing silence that screamed louder than any argument. It was as if I had become a ghost in my own family's life, visible only when it suited them, tied up and ignored the rest of the time. I began to withdraw, not because I wanted to, but because I had no other choice. The tape that had bound my hands became a metaphor for the invisible chains tightening around my spirit. I stopped calling as often, stopped asking to come over, stopped trying to insert myself into conversations where my words were met with polite nods or quick changes of subject. I watched from a distance as my family moved on, their lives full of noise and new beginnings, while I was left holding on to fragments of a past that seemed to fade with every passing day. The betrayal was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, slow, and relentless. It was the absence of concern when I was hurt, the disregard for my feelings when I was humiliated, the refusal to see me as anything other than a burden or a punchline. Yet, within this darkness, a flicker of something else began to grow, a stubborn flame of resilience that whispered, I was more than their dismissal, more than their careless jokes. The night I was tied up as a joke was also the night I realized that if I didn't take control of my own story, no one else would. That realization was both terrifying and liberating. It meant acknowledging the pain without letting it consume me. It meant understanding that love does not look like this, not mockery, not control, not erasure. It meant finding the courage to stand up, not for them, but for myself. And so the catalyst was not just the tape or the game, but the awakening it sparked inside me. It was the moment I saw clearly that my hands, my voice, my life belonged to me, and that to reclaim them I would have to untie not only the physical bindings, but the invisible ones too. It was the beginning of a journey that would lead me away from the family that had hurt me, toward a new life where I could finally be seen, heard, and valued on my own terms. After that night, when the tape was finally removed from my wrists and the laughter faded into an uneasy silence, the subtle changes began. At first, they were almost imperceptible, small cracks in the foundation of my place in the family that I tried to ignore, to explain away as fatigue or stress. But they grew slowly and steadily until I could no longer deny the shifting ground beneath my feet. It was not a sudden blow, but a quiet, persistent erosion of my presence, my voice, and my dignity. The jokes continued, but now they were less playful and more pointed, as if the tape had been a signal, a permission slip for others to treat me as less than I had always been. I noticed the way my suggestions were brushed aside during family dinners, the way my stories were interrupted or ignored during gatherings, the way the room seemed to shrink whenever I entered it. I was no longer a participant. I was a spectator, waiting in the wings for a role that was never offered. The first time I realized this shift was real, and not just in my imagination, came during a Sunday brunch. I had arrived early, as I always did, carrying a casserole dish filled with my famous baked ziti, a recipe passed down from my mother. I set it carefully on the buffet table, smiling at my daughter-in-law as she greeted me with a tight-lipped nod. The room was crowded, filled with laughter and the clinking of plates, but as I reached out to join a conversation, I felt a subtle tightening in the air, a pause in the chatter that spoke volumes. The words stopped, eyes flicked away, and the warmth I had once felt from these familiar faces was replaced by a polite distance. When I spoke, my voice was polite but tentative, and the responses were short, clipped, as if they were humoring me rather than welcoming me. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was imagining things, but the feeling settled deep in my bones, a cold reminder that the game night was not an isolated moment, but the beginning of a new reality. At home, the change was even more pronounced. Calls from my son grew less frequent and more functional. Can you pick up the kids tomorrow? Or, we need you to babysit next weekend. Requests, not invitations. Conversations were brief and transactional, stripped of the warmth that once filled them. I found myself waiting by the phone, hoping for a call that would never come, or listening for the familiar creak of the front door that signaled their arrival, only to be met with silence. The house felt emptier, not because of physical absence, but because of emotional withdrawal. I was becoming a ghost in my own family's life, present in body, but absent in heart. The kitchen table where we once shared stories was now a place where I ate alone, the quiet humming of the refrigerator, the only companion. One evening, I overheard a conversation between my son and his wife in the next room. They spoke in hushed tones, voices low, but edged with frustration. "She's so stubborn," I heard him say. "Always has to have things her way." His wife nodded in agreement. "Maybe it's time we stopped indulging her. She doesn't fit with us anymore." The words struck me like a cold wind, cutting through the fragile veil of denial I had wrapped around myself. I realized then that my presence was no longer wanted, that I was being gently but firmly pushed aside. The family I had nurtured, the home I had helped build, was slipping away from me, piece by piece. Despite the growing distance, I clung to the routines that gave me a sense of stability. I kept the garden tidy, watered the plants, and cooked meals that sat untouched on the table. I took walks around the neighborhood, trying to find solace in the familiar streets and the faces of neighbors who smiled kindly but did not ask questions. I found comfort in the small acts of care I gave myself, the warm cup of tea in the morning, the quiet moments spent reading a book, the slow, deliberate practice of knitting scarves that I never finished. These were my anchors in a sea of change, reminders that I was still here, still whole, even if those closest to me had begun to look through me rather than at me. One afternoon, I received an invitation to a family gathering, a birthday party for one of my grandchildren. The card was formal, unsigned, and left at my door. I knew who it was from. The message was clear. You are welcome, but only on our terms. I debated whether to go. I wanted to be part of their lives, to be seen and acknowledged, but I also feared the humiliation that might await me. Would I be the grandmother everyone tolerated, but did not truly welcome? Would I be the woman whose presence was a reminder of the past they wished to forget? In the end, I decided to attend, hoping to hold on to the fragile threads of connection before they snapped completely. The party was held at a suburban home, perfectly manicured and decorated with balloons and streamers. As I walked through the door, I felt the weight of 100 eyes on me, some curious, some cold, some politely disinterested. I smiled and tried to engage, but the conversations felt forced, the laughter rehearsed. My son greeted me with a brief hug and a tight smile, his eyes avoiding mine. His wife stood nearby, speaking quietly to friends, her posture stiff and guarded. The grandchildren, busy with their own worlds, barely glanced my way. I found a seat at the edge of the room and watched as the family moved around me, like a dance I was no longer invited to join. The birthday cake was cut, gifts were opened, and the evening stretched on, but the distance between us grew, silent and unbridgeable. That night, I sat alone in my room, the sounds of the party fading through the walls. I felt the sting of tears that I refused to shed in front of others. I realized that the first escalation had done its work. My place in their lives was shrinking, my importance fading like a whisper in a noisy room. The tape on my wrists had been removed, but the bonds that held me captive were now invisible, woven from neglect and disregard. I understood then that I could no longer wait for things to get better, that I needed to find a way to reclaim my life before it slipped away completely. In the quiet aftermath, I began to look outward. I visited the local library more often, not just as a visitor, but as a volunteer. The librarians welcomed me with open arms, grateful for the help and happy to share stories of books and life. I reconnected with old friends, some of whom I had lost touch with over the years. I took long walks in the park, breathing in the fresh air and feeling the sun on my face as if it were a balm for my wounded spirit. Slowly, a new rhythm emerged, one that did not depend on the approval of a family that had forgotten me, but was built on the small acts of kindness I could offer myself and others. This first escalation was a slow, creeping shadow that dimmed the light in the rooms I once called home. It was a series of silences louder than words, a retreat from love disguised as care, a turning away that spoke louder than any argument. But within it lay the seeds of change, a quiet awakening that I was no longer willing to be diminished or erased. The journey ahead would be difficult, filled with moments of doubt and loneliness, but I knew now that I had to walk it, not as the woman who waited to be untied, but as the woman who would untie herself. There was a night, not long after the family gathering, where I felt the coldest and most alone, when I lay awake in the dark and realized that something inside me had begun to change. It was subtle at first, a quiet stirring that felt like a whisper on the edge of sleep, but it grew stronger with each passing day. The weight of years spent bending to the expectations of others, the dutiful mother, the smiling grandmother, the woman who never made waves, was lifting, replaced by a resolve that surprised even me. I was no longer willing to be the background noise, the invisible presence that could be ignored or joked about without consequence. I wanted to reclaim my life, my voice, my hands, the very things that had been taken from me, one small cut at a time. The shift began with a small act of defiance, almost imperceptible in its quietness. I found myself standing in front of the mirror one morning, brushing my thinning gray hair with more care than usual. I put on a blouse that had been tucked away in the back of my closet, a soft blue that reminded me of the sky on clear spring days. For the first time in a long while, I looked at myself and saw not the tired woman who had been pushed aside, but someone who still mattered, someone who still had a place in this world beyond the roles others had assigned her. That morning, I made a decision to no longer wait for permission to live, to no longer wait for an invitation to be seen. I would step forward on my own. In the days that followed, I began to make changes, small ones that felt monumental to me. I reconnected with Joyce, the woman who owned the flower shop below my apartment, a tough, no-nonsense woman with a quick wit and a kind heart. She didn't ask questions or pity me. She simply welcomed me as a person, not a problem. I started helping out at the shop, arranging flowers and watering plants, learning the names of blooms I had forgotten over the years. The scent of fresh petals and damp earth filled the air, and for the first time in a long time, I felt rooted, alive. Joyce was not family, but she became my chosen companion, someone who saw me as I was and didn't try to fit me into a mold. With Joyce's encouragement, I applied for a job at the local library. It was a place that had always felt like home, a sanctuary of stories and knowledge, a refuge from the noise of the world. I was nervous at first. It had been years since I had worked outside the home, and I doubted whether I still had the skills or the stamina. But the librarians welcomed me warmly, appreciating my experience and my love for books. I began volunteering, shelving books, helping patrons find what they needed, sharing stories with children during story time. Each day, I felt a little stronger, a little more confident. The library was more than a workplace. It was a place where I reclaimed a part of myself that had been buried beneath years of neglect and dismissal. One afternoon, as I was closing up the shop with Joyce, I found myself standing before the bulletin board where community notices were posted. Among the usual flyers for yoga classes and neighborhood meetings, there was a small handwritten note. Room for rent, quiet lady preferred, private bedroom, near bus stop. No drama. It was a simple ad, but it felt like an invitation, a door left slightly ajar for someone like me. I called the number and arranged to see the room. The woman who answered the door was cautious but kind. Her house was old and a little worn, but it had a warmth that spoke of lived-in comfort. She introduced herself as Joyce, different from my flower shop friend, and showed me the small but cozy room at the end of a creaky hallway. The sunlight spilled through the window, bathing the space in a soft glow that felt like hope. Moving into that room was a quiet act of rebellion. It was my way of saying I belonged somewhere, that I was not a burden, but a person deserving of a home. I unpacked slowly, placing a few cherished items on the dresser. A photograph of my late husband, a well-worn novel I had never finished, a knitted scarf I had made long ago. The act of arranging these things was a reclaiming of space, a declaration that I was here and I mattered. I began to settle into a new rhythm. Mornings at the library or the flower shop, afternoons walking the neighborhood or tending to my new home, evenings reading or knitting by the window. It was a life not shaped by others' expectations, but by my own choices. This shift was not without its challenges. There were moments when the loneliness pressed in, when memories of the family I had lost seemed to haunt the quiet rooms. But there were also moments of unexpected joy. A shared cup of tea with Joyce, a smile from a stranger in the park, the gentle laughter of children during story time. These small connections became the threads of a new tapestry I was weaving, one that was fragile but real. I began to understand that freedom was not a grand event, but a series of quiet moments, each one a step away from the past and toward a future I could shape for myself. The navy wool coat I bought one crisp autumn day became a symbol of this new life. It was warm and solid, with deep pockets that felt like holding possibilities. When I put it on, I felt a flicker of pride, a reminder that I was still capable of choosing for myself, still worthy of care and respect. Wearing that coat, walking the streets with my head held a little higher, I felt a strength growing inside me, a strength born not from anger or bitterness, but from the quiet certainty that I was no longer tied down. The tape that had bound my wrists was long gone, but the true untying was happening inside me, one deliberate act at a time. In this midpoint of my journey, I was no longer the woman who waited silently for others to see her. I was a woman who chose to be seen, who stepped into the light on her own terms. The shift was not dramatic or sudden, but it was profound. It was the moment when I began to reclaim my story, to rewrite the narrative that had for so long been written by others. It was the turning point from victim to survivor, from invisible to visible, from bound to free, and though the path ahead was uncertain, I walked it with a quiet courage, carrying with me the knowledge that I was finally becoming who I was meant to be. Life in my new rhythm was fragile but growing stronger, like a sapling pushing through cracked concrete, stubbornly claiming space where none seemed to exist before. I had found small joys and quiet strength in the everyday, the scent of fresh flowers at the shop, the sound of pages turning in the library, the soft murmur of city life outside my window. Yet, even as I embraced this new chapter, the past was never far behind, creeping in with unexpected weight, reminding me that the bonds I thought broken were still tangled and knotted around my heart. The second escalation was not a violent upheaval, but a slow return of shadows, the reappearance of old ties and new complications that tested the very ground I was trying to build beneath my feet. It began with a letter, small and carefully folded, left in the mailbox one gray morning. I recognized the handwriting before I even unfolded the paper. It was Kieran's, my oldest grandchild. He was the only one who had ever reached out with anything resembling genuine concern, the only one who had not forgotten that I was more than just a name or a role. His letter was simple, full of worry and hope, asking where I was and if I was safe. He told me that his parents were frantic, that they had said I had disappeared, that no one had heard from me. There was a tenderness in his words, an honesty that broke through the cold walls I had built around myself. I read the letter twice, the edges of the paper softening with each fold, and then I carefully tucked it away without responding. I was not yet ready to reopen the door they had slammed shut. Days later, Lisa, my daughter-in-law, appeared, not in a letter, but in person. She showed up at the cafe where I worked, her coat too sharp for the drizzling rain, her smile tight and unreadable. I saw her first through the window, standing stiff and still by the pastry display, pretending to read the chalkboard menu. She looked like a woman bracing for a storm, a guest arriving uninvited to a home she did not belong in. I did not go to her. I kept wiping down the counter, pretending not to notice. She stayed for a long moment before stepping forward, her voice low and cautious as she asked if we could talk privately. We sat in a booth at the back, away from the hum of the cafe and the curious eyes of customers. She spoke carefully, explaining that she was not the one who had called the lawyer, that Adam had sent him without her knowledge. She said they had panicked, that the flight was boarding and the kids were cranky, and they had thought I was behind them at the gate. I raised an eyebrow at her. 8 hours, Lisa. 8 hours without a call, without a check, without a single attempt to find me. She looked down at her manicured hands, the edges of her nails sharp and perfect. "We didn't think you would leave," she said quietly. I looked at her and said simply, "I didn't leave. You did." There was a silence between us, heavy and unspoken, filled with all the words we would never say. Lisa reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "I don't want anything from you," she said, sliding it across the table. "But Kieran is struggling. He misses you. Adam is furious. But Kieran, he's different." I took the envelope, not because I wanted what was inside, but because I refused to give her the satisfaction of refusal. I told her Kieran didn't need a go-between, that he knew how to call. She nodded, her eyes searching mine for something she might not find. "I wasn't trying to replace you," she said softly. "I just didn't want your shadow in every room." Her words were the closest thing to honesty I had heard from her in years. I stood up and said, "I am not your shadow, Lisa. I am my own person. I finally remember how to be one." She left without finishing her coffee, and I returned to my work, the warmth of the cafe around me, but a cold weight settling in my chest. The lawyer came next, a man in a dark suit and heavy shoes who waited outside the cafe until my shift ended. When he stepped inside, he removed his sunglasses and asked in a tone too formal, too careful, "Are you Mrs. Martha Harlow?" I said I was. He introduced himself as Derek Sorensen and said he represented Adam and Lisa. They were concerned about my well-being and wanted to discuss my living situation and assets. I folded my apron, placed it on the counter, and told him flatly that my well-being was excellent and my assets were none of their business. He shifted uncomfortably and said they wanted to ensure I was in a safe environment and to discuss next steps. I told him to tell Adam and Lisa that I was not a pet and that there would be no next steps unless I took them. I walked out, leaving him blinking in the light. Arthur was waiting outside. He didn't look like he came for coffee. "You okay?" he asked simply. "Yes," I said, "because I'm not going to let anyone convince me I'm not." That evening, I wrote a letter, not to my family this time, but to Lisa. 3 lines. "I know what you did. I know what you didn't say. I'm not angry. I'm not coming back. Take care of your own life now." I mailed it the next morning with a stamp that had a bird on it, a finch, the kind that sings even in the cold. The days that followed were a blur of half steps and quiet defiance. Lisa's visit had cracked open old wounds, and the lawyer's appearance was a reminder that the past was not done with me yet. The family's attempts to control and manipulate me were relentless, disguised as concern and responsibility, but carrying the weight of entitlement and disregard. They saw me as a problem to be solved, a property to be managed, a story to be rewritten. But I was neither. I was a woman reclaiming her life, refusing to be reduced to a shadow or a joke. Even as these pressures mounted, new connections grew around me. Arthur came to the cafe every day, a quiet presence with stories about birds and memories of a wife he missed. Joyce, my friend and neighbor, offered her steadfast companionship without questions or pity. Heather, the young woman who managed the cafe, saved me cinnamon rolls and gave me extra shifts, silent affirmations that I belonged. These small acts of kindness were a lifeline, reminders that there was a world beyond the family that had turned away. The local newspaper ran a story about my disappearance, quoting Adam and Lisa's worried statements. The headline called me missing, a matriarch lost without a word. I laughed bitterly at the absurdity. They called me vulnerable. I was anything but. I kept the clipping as proof, not of my absence, but of their desperation to control the narrative. At the cafe, Arthur handed me a tiny hand-painted magnet shaped like a birdhouse. "It's silly," he said. "I just remembered something you said. I smiled and said it was perfect. This second escalation was a battle fought in silence and shadows, in letters and visits, in small kindnesses and large betrayals. It was a test of my strength and resolve, a challenge to hold on to the life I was building, even as the past threatened to pull me back into its dark grip. It was painful and exhausting, but it was also a crucible in which my new self was forged. And through it all, I held on to one truth. I was no longer the woman who waited to be untied. I was the woman who chose to be free. The moment I decided to write that final letter, to send the words I had carried in my heart for so long, was not one of fury or bitterness, but one of calm, deliberate closure. It came after days of restless nights, after the relentless knocking of the past on my new life's door, after the quiet battles and the slow unraveling of old ties. I sat at my small desk, in the room that was mine now, the one I had chosen and made my own, with the soft glow of the lamp casting gentle shadows on the walls. The paper was thick, the kind you keep for letters that matter, and I took my time, letting each word fall like a measured step along a path I was finally ready to walk alone. To whom it may concern, I wrote, my hand steady, despite the tremors of old wounds still fresh beneath the surface. There is no cause for further legal contact. I am of sound mind in a safe environment and not under duress. I have retained local legal counsel. Any further attempts to contact me under the guise of concern will be considered harassment. Sincerely, Martha Harlow. I read the letter over twice before signing it with a firmness I had not known I possessed. It was not just a letter to a lawyer or a family. It was a declaration of independence, a boundary drawn in the sand after years of being stepped over and ignored. I folded it carefully and placed it in an envelope, my breath steady, my heart calm but resolute. The next morning, I walked to the post office with a quiet dignity that surprised even me. The clerk behind the counter smiled kindly when I handed her the envelope. "Going somewhere special?" she asked. I shook my head and said, "Just sending something important." The stamp I chose was a simple finch, a small bird known for its resilience and song even in the coldest seasons. I handed over the letter and watched it disappear into the mailbox, carrying with it the weight of years and the hope of freedom. That same day, I penned another letter, not to the lawyer, not to Adam, but to Lisa. It was brief and to the point, the kind of letter that needed no flourish or apology. I know what you did. I know what you didn't say. I'm not angry. I'm not coming back. Take care of your own life now. I sealed it with a quiet finality, feeling the heavy relief of letting go. The letter was not meant to punish or provoke, but to close a chapter that had held me captive for far too long. I sent it without expectation, knowing that whatever came next was no longer mine to control. In the days that followed, the storm I had anticipated did not come. There were no furious calls, no desperate visits, no pleas for reconciliation. Instead, there was a strange silence, a vacuum where the pressure had once been. It was as if by finally drawing the line so firmly, I had shifted the balance. The family that had tried to control me was forced to acknowledge that I was no longer theirs to command. And in that silence, I found a kind of peace, a peace not born of forgetting, but of choosing. My new life began to take on a steadier rhythm. I worked my shifts at the cafe with a quiet pride, the apron tied tight around my waist like armor. Heather, ever pragmatic and kind, handed me extra shifts without asking, her way of saying I belonged. Arthur came in each day, his presence a balm and a reminder that kindness and connection were still possible. We shared stories of birds and books, of past loves and lost chances, and in those moments I felt the weight of loneliness lift, replaced by the fragile warmth of companionship. Joyce, my steadfast neighbor, remained my anchor. We spent evenings on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the moon rise and the city lights flicker below. One night, as we sipped lukewarm tea and listened to the quiet hum of the world settling down, she turned to me and said, "You know they're going to show up, right? Sooner or later." I nodded, the truth settling between us like a shared secret. "I know," I said softly, "and when they do, I'll be ready." That readiness was not born of fear, but of strength. I was no longer the woman who waited to be rescued or recognized. I was the woman who had chosen herself, who had drawn boundaries and built a life on her own terms. The coat I wore on that porch, navy and worn just enough to feel familiar, was more than fabric. It was a symbol of my resilience, a shield against the past's cold fingers. The day they did come was not marked by grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but by a quiet, inevitable reckoning. Lisa arrived at the cafe, her expression unreadable, her steps hesitant. Heather spotted her first, whispering to me as I wiped down the counter. The room seemed to hold its breath as Lisa approached, her eyes searching mine for a response I was no longer obligated to give. She asked if we could talk, and I nodded, gesturing to a booth at the back. We sat facing each other, the noise of the cafe fading into a distant murmur. Lisa spoke softly, her voice tinged with regret and exhaustion. She told me about the panic they had felt, the mistakes made, the fractures in their own lives that had spilled over into ours. She admitted that they had been wrong to treat me as an obstacle, that they had underestimated the strength it takes to walk away and the courage it takes to stay away. I listened, not with anger, but with a calm understanding that comes from having walked through fire and emerged tempered, not broken. I told her that forgiveness was not mine to give, that some wounds take time and some doors, once closed, do not open again. I told her I was no longer the shadow they could cast aside or the safety net they could pull back when convenient. I was a woman who had learned to stand on her own, who had found freedom in the silence they had once used to bind me. Lisa nodded, tears glistening in her eyes, and for a moment we shared a space of fragile truth. Then she left, leaving behind a quiet promise to try and see me, not as a problem, but as a person. That night, I stood by the window in my small room, the city lights twinkling like distant stars. I thought of the journey I had taken, from the tape that bound my hands to the letters that set me free. I thought of the friends I had made, the life I was building, the woman I was becoming, and I felt a deep, steady peace settle over me. A peace born not of reconciliation with the past, but of acceptance and self-love. I placed the final letter in the drawer, tucked beneath the old recipe cards that held memories of love and loss. I knew that life would continue to bring challenges, that the past might still reach out in unexpected ways, but I was no longer afraid. I had tied myself to a new future, one where my hands were free to build, to hold, and to heal. And that, more than anything, was my triumph, the unbinding of a spirit that refused to be silenced. The days that followed the final letters brought with them a calm I had not known in years, a stillness that was both unfamiliar and deeply welcome. The storm of voices demanding my attention, the harsh glare of expectations and disappointments, had faded into a quiet hum at the edges of my life. For the first time in a very long time, I woke up each morning not weighed down by the burden of others' judgments or the heavy chains of obligation. I was no longer waiting for a call, a visit, an apology, or a sign that I still mattered. I was simply living in a way that was fully and entirely my own. The apartment above the flower shop became a sanctuary, a place where I could be fully myself without fear of interruption or dismissal. I filled the rooms with small comforts, a vase of fresh daisies from the shop downstairs, a knitted throw draped over the armchair, a stack of books by the window. The light that filtered through the curtains in the morning felt like a benediction, a quiet blessing to start the day. I would sit with my cup of tea, watching the city wake, feeling the steady pulse of life outside and the peaceful rhythm within. It was a life without grand events or dramatic gestures, but it was enough. It was mine. At the cafe, I had found a new family, people who saw me not as a relic of the past, but as a living, breathing person with stories to tell and wisdom to share. Heather, ever practical and kind, never missed an opportunity to remind me that I belonged, that my presence was a gift, not a burden. Arthur's gentle visits brought warmth and companionship, the kind that is rare and precious. We talked of birds and books, of the small beauties of ordinary days, and in those moments I felt a connection that transcended blood and history. One afternoon, I received a letter from Kieran. His handwriting was familiar, large and deliberate, filled with hope and tentative peace. He told me he was coming to visit, alone, without his parents. He wanted to talk, to reconnect on his own terms. The letter was not a demand or a plea, but an offer, a quiet reaching out across the distance that had grown between us. I folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table, feeling a mixture of anticipation and caution. When the day came, I dressed carefully, not for him, but for myself, in the navy coat that had become a symbol of my new life. Meeting Kieran was not a grand reunion, but a quiet moment of rediscovery. We sat in a modest motel room, the air thick with unsaid words and gentle understanding. He shared stories of his work, his hopes, his struggles, and I listened with a heart open and unguarded. We did not cry or make promises we could not keep, but we held hands and shared space, two people bridging the gap of years with patience and love. He told me I was enough, and I told him the same. It was a beginning, fragile and real. With each passing day, the old wounds healed, not by forgetting, but by acknowledgement and acceptance. I stopped carrying the weight of anger and betrayal as a burden on my back and instead held it in my hands, turning it over and seeing it for what it was. Pain, yes, but also strength. I was a woman who had been broken, but had learned to mend herself with patience and grace. I was a woman who had been tied down, but had untied her own hands and walked away. One evening, as I sat on the porch with Joyce, wrapped in old sweaters and watching the moon rise over the city, I realized how far I had come. The years of silence and invisibility, the nights of loneliness and tears, had shaped me, but no longer defined me. I was no longer waiting for life to happen to me. I was living it, on my own terms, with quiet joy and steady hope. I knew the family I had left behind might never fully understand, might never truly see me as I was, but that no longer mattered. What mattered was the life I had chosen, the life I was building day by day, moment by moment. Before I closed the door on that chapter, I wrote a letter, not to my family or my lawyer, but to myself. I placed it inside my dresser drawer, tucked behind the old recipe cards that held memories of love and loss. The letter read, "Dear me, you waited so long for someone to save you. You forgot you were always the one holding the key. You didn't lose them. They let go, and you finally let go back. And look at the life that opened. Well done. Love me." It was a quiet testament to the journey from silence to voice, from bondage to freedom. And so this is where my story rests now, not in the past's shadows, but in the light of a life reclaimed. If this story finds you at the right moment, know this: it is never too late to choose yourself, to untie your own hands, to step out of the shadows and into your own light. You do not need permission or apology. You only need the courage to begin. And when you do, come back and tell me. I'll be here, waiting with open arms and a warm cup of tea.